Okay, in this video clip, I'm going to give you a brief overview, not an entire lecture, on what we're looking at in Chapter 1 and the structure of the chapter and the structure of things that are important. So first of all, we're going to start out by looking at, in the PowerPoint slides, looking at what is organizational behavior, or OB, why is it important, what is the history of OB as a discipline, what are the different ways we can approach the study of OB, and what are the implications of these different approaches. So you'll note that we're saying that organizational behavior is something that's applicable to everyone. It's not just for managers, as is often depicted in many textbooks, how to manage people, but it's also about how to get along and understand people. And it's relevant, as I said in my previous clip, to everyone at all levels of the organization. So basically, it's the study of human behavior in organizations. It's the study of the impact of that behavior on organizations, individuals, and social outcomes. So it's looking at different levels. It's a systematic set of procedures that isn't just something that is common sense. We just don't get it out of thin air. But the study of organizational behavior, although it's fairly new, is an emergence or an amalgamation of a number of different concepts, and it looks at or uses a systematic set of procedures and principles to explain workplace events and the conditions that lead to these events. So as I said, there are different approaches to the study of OB that focus on different outcomes and on varying definitions. You'll see these outlined in the PowerPoint slides and explained more thoroughly in the chapter. Okay, so organizational behavior, the key thing to remember is that it's for everyone, not just potential managers. It gives us insights to our own behavior, and it gives us insights into the behavior of other people. So it explains why we do what we do and when we do what we do. People say, why should I study organizational behavior? I'm not going into human resources, I'm going into perhaps accounting, or I'm going into computer science. And my answer is that we live in a world dominated by formal organizations. Most of what we do and what we know takes place in organizations. The key decisions that affect our lives take place in organizations. So organizations, formal organizations, shape our behavior and expectations. So the success of organizations depends on the behavior of the people in them. If you are doing accounting, for example, and you are planning on opening your own accounting firm when you finish school, you'll have to learn how to get along with the people who are working for you, or in the meantime, who you're working with. So it is, as I said, for everyone. We can use OB in a number of different ways because it helps us explain not just how to get along with people, but organizational outcomes and decision making. For example, how do different organizational crises or tragedies occur? How do we deal with them? What can we learn from how we've dealt with them? Why do people respond in certain ways in particular situations? What behavior at work is problematic, and where is it effective? How can we learn to predict that? How can we learn to deal with that? So providing clues for future action helps us maintain and make formal decisions about organizational direction. We also talk in this chapter about the levels of analysis in organizational behavior, which I alluded to in the definition of OB. It's at the individual level, which is characteristics such as motivation for individuals. It's at the group level, social level, which could cover topics such as discrimination, understanding how discrimination occurs. And it's at the organizational level, the structural level, how organizational effectiveness or ineffectiveness comes about. So remembering the levels of analysis is also key. As I said in the beginning, the study of OB is relatively new compared to other disciplines such as philosophy, for example. And it's a multidisciplinary approach, so it comes from a number of different theoretical underpinnings, different ways of us making sense of OB. Organizational behavior borrows from psychology, for example, from political science, from sociology, if we're looking at groups, from anthropology in the study of organizational culture, from economics. So it's not, and industrial engineering, it's not just from one particular discipline. It basically developed from an interest in business managers in ways of improving efficiency and effectiveness and profitability. And the roots of this approach, if we look back, come from Frederick Taylor's scientific management, which we probably have spent more time in Introduction to Business, so I won't spend too much time on Frederick Taylor. But the principles of scientific management basically were looking for ways to have work methods to increase productivity, to overcome work attitudes that decreased productivity, and to improve different levels of control. So standardization, was one best way that Taylor thought of overcoming this, where employee selection was based on ability and motivation. He felt people were motivated, in his words, were motivated by piecework pay. So it was motivation for pay. So basically, Taylor believed that man was motivated solely by money. And we have, following on the works of Taylor, we have the works of other people, including Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, Time and Motion Studies, Work Fatigue. And Gilbreth, if you may recall, the movie Cheaper by the Dozen, it's had one remake from the original, but that was based on the life story of Frank and Lillian Gilbreth. The human relations approach was another method where the study of attitudes and behaviors of individuals and organizations offered us insights into managing through techniques that are designed to change behavior. So the most famous of those were the Hawthorne studies that were carried out in the 1930s. And I encourage you to look online for some of the images and some of the information on the Hawthorne studies. Also done to increase workplace productivity, but recognizing how attitudes and behaviors and social contact and norms could affect workplace behavior. So for the purposes of this course, the definition of organizational behavior is dependent on which approach, or what we call paradigm, we're using to study OB. So we're going to look briefly at 6 paradigms or approaches in the way OB is approached, which means we can look at the same event or problem or situation using one of the different lenses that we're looking at. So in recent years, theories of OB have developed that focus on different areas of concern, not just on the managerial approach, which looks at how to increase productivity, but that now looks at race, class, gender, and ethnicity in organization. And this helps us broaden our understanding of how people in organizations behave. So as I said, there was a typical approach, the managerial approach, where the focus is on the manager and the focus is on the impact that individuals, groups, and structures have on OB. So how do attitudes and behaviors contribute to organizational efficiency would be the key question in this approach. And this is the most common approach that you will find. The other approach, or another approach, another paradigm, would be the focus on the organizational member. So this would look at how beliefs and attitudes create and contribute to work situations and organizational practices. How do you know, for example, the question we'll be looking at here, how to behave in certain situations? How do people develop a sense of organization through a series of behavior? How do you know, for example, when you go inside a classroom that you are supposed to, as a student, sit at the front and the teacher or faculty member goes to the front of the classroom? How are those orders given meaning? How do they come to be negotiated? How in the workplace does the boss know that he or she has certain roles and expectations and certain maybe unwritten rules about their behavior? And how does the employee know what the lines are drawn for his or her behavior. Whereas if you were looking at organizational behavior from a radical approach, you would be focusing on the impact of the organization on the worker. The question here would be the impact of the working condition in the workplace on the people working in them. So for example, the impact of the working condition in factories and in coal mines on workers. What could be done to make these things better? How do these affect the behavior of the people in these organizations? The viewpoint here would be very different from the managerial approach, and it would take the view that organizations are domineering and detrimental to the employee. People are employed not because of their personal characteristics, instead their skills are used to contribute to profit. So someone investigating from this perspective would be looking at how the organization detrimentally affects employees. Feminist approach is an approach that really wasn't developed or looked into or even thought about until the mid-1970s. OB didn't challenge the neglect of gender in organizational studies. We tended to assume that organizations were all the same and that we checked our gender at the doorway when we went in. So in this approach, we would be looking at ways to increase women in trades, in management, and looking at the impact of the organization on women. So the impact of gender and sexuality on recruitment and promotion, on organizational behavior would be approaches here. Looking for causes of gender discrimination and sexual harassment would be some of the research questions and focuses here. The ratio-ethnicity approach is similar. The focus is on people of color. Until the mid-70s, again, there was little said about race and ethnicity at work. So current research looks at whether or not OB, as it is understood, can overcome ingrained ways of thinking. Where is discrimination taking place? And finally, the postmodern approach, where the focus is on looking for meaning. The focus is on the subject. So we would be looking here, what does it mean to be a good employee? How is this constructed? How do we give meaning to our roles within the organization? And how is this constructed through different organizational rules and structures? How do policies such as HR policies and HR techniques impact on a people's sense of self and identity? So these are the different lenses that we look at. I've gone through them very quickly and very briefly here, but these are some of the highlights of things that we should be keeping in the back of our mind. There's no one right approach when we're looking at OB. The purpose of this chapter is to get you to think about what organizational behavior is, what the different lenses are, different ways of approaching it and studying it, and different ways of understanding it, and the different focuses we can have at looking at maybe the same organization but bringing forward different problems or different issues in it. So we might see something, a situation, and think, okay, how do we change that? How do we make the organization more efficient in this particular event? That would be a managerial approach. Or we might look at the same organization and say, there aren't that many women employed in this organization. What does this mean, and how can we improve the role of women or improve the role of people of color if it's a ratio-ethnicity approach in this organization? So these would be other lenses to look at as well. What is the meaning here? Why do people behave in a certain way? Why did this organization decide to undergo change, for example? Why did they decide to introduce a particular policy or program? That would be the interpretivist approach. We're trying to understand and make sense of how this negotiated order comes to be. Why are policies here? The postmodern approach. So the key points to take away from this chapter are, again, to reiterate what I said at the front, what is OB? Why is it important? What's the history of it? And that goes into much more detail in your textbook. How do we approach these studies, and what are the implications of these different approaches in how we would carry these studies out? So I encourage you to read the chapter, have a look, and engage in the discussion questions which we'll be looking at. And don't forget your introduction, and we'll be back to you next week. Thanks, and have a good week.